Just a warning. This episode contains topics and or language that could be heavy or triggering and may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Hey everybody, I'm Zoe.
And I'm Chandi.
And this is Bound by the Cloak. Today's topic is a bit different than things that we've covered in the past, and it is definitely quite a sensitive subject. Pedophilia is a topic that most, if not everyone, has very strong opinions about. It makes us emotional for reasons that are completely understandable. Chandi and I had been having conversations and trying to figure out how to cover this topic. And we really wanted to know what made a pedophile tick and to understand exactly what a pedophile actually is. And so we spoke to Dr. James Cantor.
Dr. James Cantor is a clinical psychologist who specializes in atypical sexualities such as hypersexuality, paraphilias, pedophilia, and sex offending. We understand that it's very difficult to hear about this topic from a different perspective, but we ask you to just be a little open-minded in listening to this episode.
Today we're here with James Cantor. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is James Cantor, and I'm a sex researcher and neuroscientist. I essentially study, what in the brain makes anybody interested in whatever it is they're interested in. And by, sheer fluke of luck, I've ended up studying pedophilia. What makes people who are interested in children? If we could figure out, why they are the way they are, then one, maybe we can do something about it. But two, maybe we can do something about it before it's too late. Everything that we have and all of the focus and energy that society's put on it, understandably, is through the justice system, correctional system. But it's too late. There's already been a victim, and the best we can do is preventing another victim. But if we could get at the beginning, we could prevent that first victim from happening. Now, how I got into this is bizarre story unto itself. I just grew up a gay kid wondering, why am I different from other people and so on. And way back, the question was, is being gay, a brain thing? Is it learned? Are you born that way? Is it something that happens? And from that knowledge, I'll say, went the two main schools of thought. Well, maybe we can therapy their way out of it. Versus it's inborn, which is what, the gay community pretty much was always saying, just because it felt so inborn, and conversion therapy didn't work. We tried it. I should say they tried it. This again was the generation even before me and my graying hair. And, then eventually the studies started coming out, in the late 80s, early 90s that, we started finding stuff in the brain that demonstrated, born this way. By sheer fluke, I was studying to be a psychologist at the time, and I ended up, in a lab that was doing research on sex offenders. And they, were thinking about, could they do now this analogous kind of research instead of figuring out why are gay people gay? Why are pedophiles? Same set of questions. Completely different ethics, for gay people, have a condom and have a good time, where, there is a meaningful impact on society to be had other than for the people themselves. It was just a completely different ethical question with different social impacts. So that's, 25 years later. We've been able to establish from beginning to end, it's a brain thing. That's why we have people with strings of victims, because therapy doesn't work. It's just like trying to do conversion therapy on pedophiles. Even though we have a good reason to try to do that this time, it tells us the same thing. That's not how we're going to be able to manage the problem. The number one rule, or the number one lesson, is pedophilia is not a synonym for child molestation. People get that impression because the only time we ever hear the word pedophilia is when there's a victim. It's in the newspapers and, but, pedophile finishes work, goes home, has a glass of wine and watches the news. We never see that. We never see the non-victim, but the psychologists, we get people coming in with, "Doc, I got a problem," asking for conversion therapy or what amounts to conversion therapy. So there are people, who are genuinely pedophilic, but no evidence that they ever did anything harmful or inappropriate with another person. And people often don't know this. Also, the other way around. But the majority of people who do actually become child molesters, who do actually offend against a child, aren't actually pedophiles. They're more sexually attracted to adults than they are to children. That pattern usually happens in incest cases, where it's a parent, usually a father or stepfather, doing something inappropriate with their kid. They're using the kid, as a surrogate because they don't have access or don't think they have access to an adult partner, even though they would prefer an adult partner. And that's, roughly 2/3 of the actual hands-on, I'll call them, sex offenders against children. So, so these are overlapping a bit, Venn diagram circles, but they're not, as I say, they're not synonyms. There are pedophiles who are not child molesters, and there are child molesters who are not pedophiles. So of the pedophiles, again, it's an enormous chunk. If we could figure out, the better we can figure out the chain of events that leads to somebody being sexually interested in children, as I said, if we could come up with a prevention method, early detection method, a genuine kind of therapy to do something about the problem, now we're talking real prevention efforts. We're not just preventing another victim, a repeat victim, we're preventing victim number one. What I find over and over again is just the idea of being nice to a pedophile, right? Even the sentence just gets caught in people's throat.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just like the thought of it rubs you the wrong way.
Of course, it's automatic. We hear pedophile, we think child molestation. The association is built in because we've been through it so many times, or we've heard that kind of news so many times. And this is where, I sit in a funny seat. I have the opportunity, for better or for worse, I also get the stories from the other ones. Emails from all over the world. "Doc, I got a problem. Doc, what do I?" No reason to think that they're an offender. Sometimes they band together to try to just support each other. It's tough, even for these people, to find a therapist. Essentially, what we're asking these people to do, what we have to require these people to do, is to be celibate for life. 0 exceptions. Not even pornography to help take the edge off of their sex drive, without being able to tell a soul. And yet, so why aren't you married? Are you dating anybody? The usual kind of, questions that
I've never even thought about that.
Right.
I've never thought about that.
And not even be able to go to a therapist and say, "Doc, I got a problem," because they're afraid. Naturally, these kinds of laws are, in many jurisdictions, mandatory reporting. Legislatures pass these laws, and the public often demands these kinds of laws, thinking that they're protecting children by ratcheting up whatever their requirements are. But it doesn't actually help. If we could get, a person into a psychiatrist, psychologist, whoever, therapy support, what management techniques, whatever's appropriate for the particular person, sex drive reducing medications, whatever we can do, that could help. But if the person can't come in the first place, all we've done is drive them underground. They don't cease to exist. We've just moved them to where we don't have to see them. So, we pat ourselves on the back and we feel better because we pushed them out of view. But guess where the problems happen? Out of view. That's the problem. We're making the problem worse, congratulating ourselves for just how much we can tighten the thumb screws. Again, I can't blame anyone, especially, somebody was a victim or there were these kinds of situations in their families. If I were in their shoes, I might have exactly the same emotional reaction. But that doesn't change the situation that by giving into the emotions instead of tapping our inner Vulcan and coming up with a logical solution, we're actually making it worse.
What is a pedophile and how do they manifest in terms of the neurology or neuroscience?
In the beginning, we had to go, we knew nothing. We knew nothing. So we had to be on the lookout for anything. The first kind of studies, and especially then, this was really the early days of MRI technology. Really, the way this kind of research was done was indirect. Before the kind of brain scan technology and the computerized analyses that we had now, we had to look indirectly. We had to look for clues. And the first big clue, I was studying neuropsychology, different brain functions. So we were studying how well their brains functioned. IQ tests, memory tests, attention tests, handedness, and just standard, the same kind of stuff we would do if a patient came in with a headache and we needed an idea of what their strengths and weaknesses were so we could compare them to norms in order to get an idea of which parts of the brain were functioning, which were up to snuff, and which ones were, they were losing some cognitive function, or tracking the progress of Alzheimer's, so we could get an idea of the order of the symptoms and so on. So we started with that stuff and indirect clues that kept saying, yeah, something's there, something's in the brain. IQ were a couple of points lower than average, but the smoking gun was handedness, left-handed versus right-handed. So far as brain organization is concerned, ambidextrousness goes with left-handedness. So again, for brain, it's which hemisphere is dominant. Right hemisphere dominant people are left-handed or ambidextrous. Most people are left hemisphere dominant, which gives us right-handedness. It's the nerves cross as they go through the spinal cord. And it's roughly 10% of the regular population is, we say non-right-handedness, because as I say, ambidextrousness or ambiguous handedness indicates an atypical wiring of the brain. But it was over 30% of the pedophiles. There's only one thing that determines handedness, and it's brain organization. Handedness isn't something that's learned. And even if in the times when people were forced to use one hand over the other, they were forced to use right-handedness. So if we were finding an excess of left-handedness, the only way to explain this is something was not usual. This doesn't say anything about left-handers themselves, and for the record, I'm left-handed. But the only way to get there is an atypical architecture of the brain. And that architecture, that setup of hemispheric dominance happens early in brain development, roughly first trimester of pregnancy. Whatever is different or whatever was different about the development of a pedophile, it's in the brain, and it was there from the beginning. It was just from this indirect variable that nobody would think to look at. And again, it's 10% of everybody. So somebody being left-handed. It's also gifted kids, mathematically oriented kids. It indicates just something atypical and not even necessarily bad. Often it means something happened during the pregnancy. Left hemisphere develops more quickly than the right, and then the right catches up. Maternal stress, poor diet, whatever it is, it's something wasn't usual when one hemisphere does its growing. So the other hemisphere tries to catch up and take over the functions that normally are done by the dominant hemisphere. And one of those things that switches over is handedness. So something was different, and it was different early. Biological, inborn, but not necessarily genetic. It kind of runs in families a little bit, but most of it, as I say, is this biological, but still environmental. It's not inherited. It's an interaction between the mother's immune system, and then the kid's brain. So it's environment to biology to brain to kid instead of genes from parent to child. And it was on the basis of that and the IQ tests and that kind of stuff that then we could, like real scientists, go to the granting agencies and look, we found a smoking gun. We got and that's when we started getting the research grants really to start, okay, let's try, big regular MRI study to see if we can find what in the brain was specifically, which chunks of the brain were different in these people. So it was one of the years and years I talked, but it was, one of those, oh boy, a juicy kind of topic. So that's what we did. I was working in a clinical facility that examined, sex offenders, who were being released to parole and probation, and there was a standard part of testing, to help allocate, again, supervision resources to which of these people, were potentially the most dangerous, so our psychological and psychiatric reports then goes to the parole and probation officers, to help them decide who needs to check in more regularly and who needs closer supervision and so on. But these people were just getting released out of jail, so they were perfectly happy to volunteer for studies for the, money they were given to participate. And actually, they were curious. Most of them, some of them were really psychopaths and just didn't care. But most of them, or most of the ones who volunteered, they wanted to know too. These were not, happy people. Very often, they know they messed up. They know they did something wrong from their point of view. They had to suppress it. They slipped. I say slip, and I don't want to belittle. Again, everybody automatically thinks of the worst kind of crime they can think of. That's our reflex. The majority of them are something inappropriate. Grabby, touchy, as I say, inappropriate, but not the, full-scale child abduction, rape kind of nightmare, which, as I say, where we have a disproportionate view that the rare cases are the most common kind of case because it's the most dramatic cases that get reported and talked about the most, retweeted the most. So we have an idea that it's the most common, but actually it's the most rare. Most of them are these, as I say, inappropriate kinds of behavior.
I don't think most people even knew that or know that.
How could anybody know it? Every case is not the worst possible case. They exist, but it's not immediately, oh my God, you're a pedophile apologist. You're trying to, right. And somebody should be checking your computer. And I start getting, email messages with pictures of wood chippers. It's hard for a lot of people to be rational about this topic.
So it was more on the impulsive end, whereas sex offenders groom their victims. They know exactly what they're doing, right? Is there a difference? I
don't know if they always do. I don't know if they always groom them. Some people just get attacked.
There is no one kind. There exist, as I say, the psychopaths. They don't care if it harms anybody else. Right. They have been able to either talk themselves or they just don't care. There are people who find that they get away with it, so they will just kind of get away with it. Again, they exist. Very often they've been associated with institutions that give them access to children, churches, school teachers. They exist. We hear about the kinds who engage in grooming behavior, not because of how common they are, but it's a side effect of, again, reasonable efforts that we try to teach our children what to look out for, what to be on the lookout for. And this guy who's being nice, he may not be getting you an ice cream just because he's a nice guy. It's where, teaching kids, to be alert isn't going to help anything, with the real heinous types. As I say, with child abduction, being aware is not going to help that. But as I say, again, the most common offender are really the parents and step-parents, kids, people in the kids' environment where putting your arm around them and being affectionate, that's normal. In fact, kids are damaged when there isn't healthy affection in close relatives and family, friends, and so on. So as I say, so the awareness of grooming comes from we and parents, often feel helpless. And so that kind of education, I'll call it, really kind of bleeds off of that awareness, but it's actually a small fraction of the genuine offenders. So they exist, but there's the full range of everybody. And like, the full range of the full population, high IQ, well-functioning people that normally we would admire and want our kids to spend more time with because successful person, we want them to be a role model. All the way through, the functioning scale until, people with profound other issues, either psychological issues, very low IQs, and they have the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. To them, hanging around with 8-year-olds is normal to them. That's the level of their social functioning. So, and when, pick an age, 10, 11-year-olds, and the sexual curiosity, which is, again, natural and healthy in children. But if you have somebody in the environment, somebody who lives down the block with whatever cognitive disability, we often forgive their behavior because, they don't know better. They can't control themselves quite the same way. But they also lack, usually, a healthy adult sexual contacts in their environment. So child kind of sex play, right? It gets kind of irky and messy, and doesn't mean the guy's evil, but the stuff we need to do right is very different from, this highly punitive, where justice starts looking like vengeance.
People just see red. There's no...
Right. And every case is the worst possible case. Right. And if you say mild offense, there's no such thing as a mild offense, and we start getting... And we start treating everyone like the worst one. I cannot understand the emotion, but mostly we're wasting resources that could be better placed or better allocated, matching, the risk of the situation to the resources we need to do something about it. So as I say, it's the full range. And you also used very accurately, impulsive. A lot of it is impulsive. These are people whose psychological issues or neurological issues. Yeah, it's impulsive. They're not actually into kids. It's just there was an opportunity and they grabbed. Or to them, it was a joke. Or they didn't appreciate, whatever delicate situation the other person was in. Or it's not touching at all, flashing. And they think it's funny to flash to a kid because, they think it's funny to see the bizarre reaction that they're anticipating out of the kid. And we count that as a sex crime. He must be a pedophile, rather than, no, the thing we need to deal with this person is sometimes it's exhibitionism. They're actually turned on by that. And sometimes it's impulsivity, which doesn't forgive it at all. But the way to fix it and the way to prevent it depends. So we're stacking up the MRIs. We start, these exquisitely complicated kinds of analyses that, that the computers were only just getting to the point where they had the processing capacity to handle images. This is before we had MPEGs and computer-generated images. So we were able to chunk it through, and we compared, the average pedophile brain of, all the offenders that we collected from our lab, and I compared them to people who committed other kinds of crimes, non-sex offenses. Because if I just compared the pedophilic sex offenders to just regular people from society, if I found a difference, I wouldn't know if that difference was because they're pedophilic and other people aren't, or is it because they were willing to commit a crime and these other people had better self-control. I wouldn't know what feature of the person went with what feature of the brain. So specifically, we compared them to other people who committed a crime, were in jail, and were getting released to parole and probation. So the only real difference was they're into kids versus not into kids. So chunked it all through. I had these really talented research assistants at the time, and what the computer finally told us at the end was no differences. I think that probably that's when my hair started to gray. All of this time, all of this effort, all of this enthusiasm, nothing. But as I say, they were really good research assistants. They just, continued processing the data for, chunks of tissue in the brain that really don't have anything to do with anything. It was just connective tissue, but they were doing it just for completeness. Ding, ding, ding. There were these enormous differences in the connective tissue. Okay, we found something. My career is saved, but what would this fibrous kind of stuff, we're now going back 15 years, or we're going back now 15 years. This is before we recognized just how much in the brain really did depend on white matter. Before those days, and we were just at the cusp of it, all of the important stuff, or stuff we thought was important, was what's going on the surface of the brain. That's where the surface area is. That's where we were able to stick probes and needles. Those are the parts that were active, because that's where most of the, centers. You remember what a neuron looks like. You have this funny kind, and then the long tail. And so this part, the center of the body of the neuron was where we thought all the action was. It was active or not. It's what decided, whether to send a signal down that connective tissue or not. And that the bulk of that for the higher cognitive functions is on the surface of the brain. It's only now, it wasn't just, too much or not enough of those cell bodies. It was the pattern of who was talking to who in the brain. And so again, it was just this set of fibrous, what was connected to, and what they found, two large chunks of it. Occipital frontofasciculars and another great big fiber tract. What I was expecting walking into this, I thought we would see a sex center, which is pretty much what everybody thought. But it was only then that we, again, could not make heads or tails. Why would this chunk or any other chunk, how can that produce pedophilia? What just made no sense. I had work to do. Pushed, my own stack of data to the side. I'd catch up on my reading for, all the other stuff and what other scientists are reporting, until all of a sudden I ran into this paper, which was just reviewing which parts of the brain light up when you show somebody erotica, porn, regular everyday people. Not they weren't doing anything with child porn. They were looking for the sex center. What they found was there is no sex center. There's a sex network. A bunch of areas light up in the brain. There wasn't just, deep inside, remember the 4 Fs, the old instincts, way down, feed, flight, fight, and sex. Should be fornicate. What they found is the visual system lights up. In retrospect, the self-control area lights up. Again, as I say, in retrospect, we should have predicted it. The sensory motor strip, the parts of the brain that controls, because their brain is processing movement. And so the parts of the brain, we match up. The same parts of the brain that we use to control our own movement is also used as we're visually interpreting people moving in our environment. It was, as I say, a network of a bunch of different areas that light up when somebody's watching or engaged in sexual activity. The cabling tissue that wires that network together was the big chunk of connective tissue that I found. All of a sudden, it all came together with insufficient and irregular cabling of not the sex point, but the sex network. The function of that network is to detect in the environment what a viable reproductive partner is. That's how we evolved to get to be us. But it's also same basic social instincts. If a person, sees a child, ancient, this is how we evolved. Head large in proportion to body, eyes, large, relative. Natural social instincts for caring for a child. The nurturing instincts are just automatically triggered in us. Our voices go up. We try to make ourselves little, are you okay? Can I find you something? Perfectly natural. If we see somebody attractive, men, widen their stance, their voice goes down a little deep, completely with, I don't want to say unconscious, but it just happens automatically. It's a social reflex. Women, they see somebody attractive, they find excuses to touch their hair, sit up a little straighter, accentuate. Again, a little bit of flirtation, just automatic. We are the product of 5 billion years of evolution, and it's because we were the ones who got these instincts. But if those social networks aren't cabled together, it almost literally a cross wiring. If when brain perceives head larger to body, instead of, or in addition to, triggering the nurturing avuncular responses, it's also triggering the sex responses. That's pedophilia. A literal cross-wiring in the brain so that the wrong set of features is triggering the other instinct.
There was just like a really big breakthrough in terms of understanding that it's a whole network and not just a center. That sounds pretty big to me, because then that affects other areas of research as well.
Once that was reported, it pretty revolutionized, how we think about how a lot of these things in the brain work. And these were, now people talk about it like it's nothing. Now we talk about neuroplasticity and the brain, being able to change, where not long ago, from my point of view, we assumed it was perfectly static. Unfortunately, people have kind of gone, in our natural rebelliousness, people have gone a bit too far in the other direction. Now people think nothing is static. It's mostly static. We just found a couple of exceptions. So it's not, we can't take anything for granted, but it's usually true instead of entirely true.
So since you say it's a mix of environmental and so it's so complicated, so there's really no way to predict how the environment would affect a pregnant woman. It's across cultures, it's global.
And that is one of the clues, that it is so cross-cultural and across classes, that says that this has got to be something about being human, It's not right. It's not just about wealth. It's not, any one thing. It's exactly because it's so ubiquitous. That's a clue to it. Also, still an unanswered question is, how did this survive evolution at all? These people, right, are less likely to be, get somebody pregnant because they're not as interested in reproductive age partners.
You are, one of the few academics, experts who is pretty outspoken. So why do you do it? Your life would be so much easier if you didn't, right?
You'd think. As you might guess, I've asked myself that question a couple of times, and I still now and then am given pause. Not over whether to do this, but, which battle to pick. Do I want to get involved in this? Do I want to get involved in that? Because, it can start with, just one tweet, and then all of a sudden it's this big time consuming thing. Or, some of these are ethically complicated issues that, these are not simple. There are pluses and minuses, and, it takes some thought on my part, where are my ethics? Do I want to work with people with whom I disagree with every single other issue but this one? Do I work together with usually the other side? Right, I run into that a lot. The question for me is not, this side or that side. The question is, where exactly is the line? Because that's where the debate is. The only answer I've ever been able to come up with is that I was inoculated since very, very young. Just growing up a gay, nerdy Jewish kid, I too, felt different often from the people around me. So I had to grow the skin. I was not going to be, in my mind, popular, and it's just clever, naturally, mathematically, scientifically oriented, just by whatever blobs, form that network. And my role model, of course, was Mr. Spock. Logic, math, computers, and, I was an unhappy kid. And so doing away with emotion was a logical way to deal with it. I don't know if I automatically want to recommend it. And again, I had the academic talent to get away with that kind of a situation. But then, as I came out as gay and happy, healthy, blah, 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 but I still had that, as I say, inoculation to, I didn't have to be popular, but I did want to know the right answer. And once you do the math and, the answer is 3.2, I don't care what everybody else says. I did the math. The answer is 3.2. And that's that. So as it came to, so just by, and then, in the class when sometimes I was the only person who figured out the answer, sometimes it was because I don't care if other people like it, I was the only one willing to say it or ask an uncomfortable question where everybody else was still too worried about how will this make me look. And I just, starting with school stuff, didn't care. I was the first one, today it's easy, I'll say. I was the first one to come out as an atheist. Again, we're back in the 70s where that wasn't at best people then were agnostic. But to actually, as a teenager to decide, despite having grown up Jewish, I'm an atheist, it was where even other people, and they would tell me they kind of agree with me, but they're not going to say it out loud. And so issue by issue, I just had opportunities to take on more and more complicated issues because, well, I don't care what they think. Well, I don't care what they think. Well, I don't care. Once I have the right answer, it's not like, I don't want to upset people for the sake of upsetting people. It's just, I'm not going to swallow it. And so I learned how to reason through these emotionally provocative issues in a way that few other people were willing to, because they still were so concerned with how it might make them look.
And so you had mentioned figuring out what's going on in the brain. How did you apply the findings from the research to how you deal with patients, how you help treat patients?
Oh, that's I don't want to say proudest, but that was one of my greatest pleasures, is how that shifted things.
Okay.
Once I just wanted the right answer. And once I was legitimately able to say, I understand, you were born this way, you didn't pick this, tears in their eyes. Somebody understood. Somebody got it. Somebody,
Really?
once they could, because all the therapists at the time were, let's find out what happened in your background relationship with parents. Were you yourself abused? Were you abused and you don't remember it? And the
Because
wheels spinning in the sand. This wasn't helping anybody. They were all wasting time, and these were people, they weren't asking exactly to be in therapy. They were, forced to be in therapy. Otherwise, they're back in jail. Otherwise, it's a violation of their
Right.
parole, which is also an ethical conundrum for therapists. But all of a sudden, they could now have an honest conversation. It felt like I was born like this, and now we could talk about actually dealing with it. As I said, it's one of those, again, melts my, I'll say, half Vulcan heart, that to watch them transform at the end of 2 sentences, now we can actually talk meaningfully about how to. And, as I was presenting this science to not just the sex researchers, but to, the forensic people, the groups of therapists, who were studying sex offenders, not necessarily, the functioning of pedophilia, but the rehabilitation and how to do that kind of therapy and so on. Once I was able to, start with the slides and showing the diagrams, this is in the brain, again, a revolution. Because they all knew what they were doing wasn't working. They weren't converting anybody. They were therapists who didn't want to be there or saying what they were saying, patients who didn't want to be there and saying what they're saying. But all of a sudden, as I say, overnight, it just, now this makes sense. And the whole task changed into curing, converting pedophiles into managing a situation that they were born with and can't change. We need to contain it in whatever most healthy way available to us. So that's so it just changed the whole purpose of the entire endeavor, and that's so even though I have no short number of detractors, maybe is the right word, in other branches of academia, that gang, to them I was a hero. To them I feel more like a messenger. So I just kind of gave information that made sense, confirmed what a lot of them were suspecting anyway, but then finally had the science to prove it. So all of us then could take a big leap forward and start doing much more meaningful. Now we can work on genuine prevention, genuine therapy, and it just transformed the goals to something realistic, achievable, and effective.
Prior to all those breakthroughs, that the idea was that, maybe this is like a cycle of molestation that causes this, right? Because I think a lot of times when just people generally talk about pedophilia, that's the idea they have. Like, oh, it must have been like they must have been molested, and then something, it just kind of continues. But obviously,
cycle of abuse, they used to call it.
But obviously that's not the case.
Yeah, and there was never any good research to suggest it either. The idea is very old. The idea goes back to Freud, ancient repetition compulsion, he called it. And it was just, I don't know if I want to say common sense, but it was just a like begets like kind of a thinking. It just, felt kind of logical, but there was never any good evidence for it. What the evidence really said was chaotic childhood produces chaotic adulthood. Didn't matter what kind of chaos was in childhood. Didn't matter if it was sexual abuse, non-sexual, physical violent abuse, or even neglect. Then the families that those people produced in adulthood were more likely to contain. Could have been any of those: sexual abuse, physical abuse, or neglect. It was chaos begot chaos. The connection seemed to be the disinhibition and the lack of healthy relationships in general. there was never any evidence for the like makes like, that sex abuse begets sex abuse and neglect begets neglect. There was never evidence for that. It was kind of non-caring environment produces non-caring environment. But so as I and it also, the idea that like made like also made sense to the behaviorists. Only instead of these bizarre psychoanalytic theories, it was now a relatively logical behavioral theory, but still no evidence for it anyway. So in this particular case, the combination of the separation between pedophilia and child molestation and the identification that the pedophilia part of it was neurological, but the ugly environment, chaos begets chaos part, that seems to be more, kind of learned or imitated, or people who, don't learn the socially appropriate and healthy behavior of childhood. They don't have role models of parenthood for when they themselves become parents.
I guess to you personally, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned about this research, about pedophilia, about pedophiles?
Mirror neurons. There's a phenomenon in sexuality where rather than somebody being attracted to whatever it is they're attracted to, they want to be that thing. There are, pedophiles, but there are also people, into diapers and infantilism. They want to be treated like a kid. That's part of their fantasy. They want to be the kid instead of being attracted to a kid. In BDSM, there are people who want to, be the dominant rough and tumble part, but there are also the people who want to get that kind of abuse. There are biological men attracted to women. There are biological men who are sexually aroused by the image of themselves as women. We call that phenomenon autogynephilia. They're attracted to being the woman. As I said, there's this funny kind of, brain network, sex center. I was completely unrelated, just catching up on my reading. Mirror neurons, what's that? Accidental discovery by a research assistant, doing brain experiments with a monkey. They were doing experiments, sensory motors strip, what they found was when the research assistant was eating an apple, I think it was an apple, lunch, whatever, the monkey's brain lit up not from moving its arm, which is what that electrode was set up to detect, but by seeing somebody else move that arm, like a mirror. The mirror neurons are part of the chunk for that strip of white matter that cables together the pieces of the sex network.
So I have a question about how often people actually come forward and admit and want help for their attraction to children. Mm-hmm. And I guess another question on the tail end of that is, how many pedophiles, because usually when we think of a pedophile, we're thinking of a male. How many are actually female?
The first part, how many come forth, but there, have now groups have gotten together, the virtuous pedophiles, VERPED, groups that, they know what's going on. These are the people who have, sworn off, anything inappropriate and just support each other, and especially the older ones supporting the younger ones who are still learning how to deal with it and live a healthy, productive life. So they certainly exist. We're never going to know how many. It's not like they have any motivation to tell the truth and they have every motivation to lie. Yeah, we're never going to know the answer. Flip side, there are other people who come in and say or think that they're pedophiles, but aren't. They have OCD. They have an obsessive fear that they're pedophiles, but they're not. They're dealing with a completely different issue. So we can't take even the ones who say that they are for granted that they actually are. We have to do, a formal test, show them, in a laboratory setting, adults and children, and actually measure their reactions to them. It's the only objective way to know. For women, excellent question. And again, it turned out to be a clue. It really doesn't seem to happen in women at all. Rare, 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 rare. I mean, small handful of cases, maybe. Women who do inappropriate things with children, again, very, very, very rare, but happens now and then, usually together with some, profound other, mental health issue, but not quite zero. The part I say that, this is a clue. Why would it only happen to men? Okay, men are evil. But other than that, this is a clue. What does this tell us? What does this suggest or rule out as the possible explanations? What people should have said but never didn't is the majority of the victims are female. If this like-make-like theory were true, why would all the perpetrators be one and the victims the other?
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
What things turn out to be, the clue that led to, is that female sexual interest patterns do not work the way male sexual interest patterns. It just, men, hot, not. And that's pretty much it. Women, context, relationship, maybe, it depends, ish. There's, and this is really where the word start, fluid, in a more meaningful fluid, including for things where women do not want to be attracted, find themselves at kinks, for example. The one kink of all of those different kinks that I was mentioning, all of those are predominantly male, except masochism as a kink.
What can be done to kind of curb the behavior or thoughts or, the attraction that pedophiles have to children?
The main question really, I think, is what can society do?
Well,
and the number one rule, I almost want to say it facetiously, calm the heck down. Let's go with the evidence. Just the basics. What we know about stopping those crimes is, so far, exactly the same as preventing every other crime. Basic mental health. It's when people are desperate and have nothing to lose, they act like a person who's desperate with nothing to lose. But when they're healthy, when they have a job, when they're allowed to have a job, when they're allowed to, it's possible for a person to lead a happy, healthy life, they will act to protect it rather than put it at risk. Again, there exist psychopaths where the only answer is to take them out of circulation. But the great, great majority of them is the basics. Education, mental health support, healthy people around them. It's the same treatment or set of policies that we would use for any mental health condition and to prevent any kinds of crime. Deal with the drugs and alcohol, deal with whatever unmet social and mental illnesses that are in any population. It's the same as with anything else. There's not going to be the kind of magic bullet, set up a certain situation and that'll be the end of it. Stop making things worse. And let's start, with basic crime prevention before we start talking about how do we stop this crime? The same way that we stop all crime. Let's just start with that before we start looking for something specific.
Because everybody talks about, chemical castration, and they go straight for all of that, that level, that caliber of, treatment.
They're not interested in treatment. They're interested in vengeance.
After you generally explain all of this to people, I mean, is it that the majority just go yeah, I get it now? Are there still some people that'll fight you on it?
Like I was saying before, if they're willing to listen to me at all, give me just the 2 minutes to spell it out for you, and almost without exception, it brings everybody to the, oh, now I get it. But the people who won't listen to it to begin with, they just, oh, I've heard of you. You're one of those who, They don't give
They're just not
me
hearing
the
it at all.
opportunity to say it. They don't give themselves the opportunity to learn something about it. And again, I often have to forgive them. Often these are people who themselves are victims. I can't blame them for, these are the ones who were fooled. Their own kid was abused by whatever, her husband, so she's on the lookout, she's naturally suspicious. And again, ancient brain that evolved to protect and look out for danger. And if I'm not, wholeheartedly, on the wood chipper advocacy committee, then I'm close enough and they've had a traumatic experience. And so I can't blame a traumatized person for doing, having the effects on them that trauma has on the people. So again, I can't blame them, but still it's not helping. But once people, are willing to, anybody with any fraction of their mind left open, very, very quickly, exactly like you two have. It's that makes sense. And it does fit all of the pieces together.
So I was talking to somebody about, sex offenders and pedophilia the other day. And in Florida, there's like a community of sex offenders.
Oh, yeah.
What is it? Miracle Village? Or maybe that's what it used to be called. What do you think of the idea? Once again, it's still kind of isolating them away from other people and, kind of
it's another side effect
there.
of people just being irrational and making the problem worse. The way it happened essentially was just jurisdiction after jurisdiction was just banning, people with a history of whatever their history was. So there was nothing left except whatever piece of swampland and, whatever, only mansions were there, so it was just not realistic. It's an example of doing exactly the reverse of what the science has already established for how to prevent crime. Is instead of helping people integrate in a healthy way in society, they've left only the unhealthy options. And politicians and the public congratulating themselves for being, so stern with the bad guys, when all they've done is put them together and putting people with a criminal history together. Oh, what bad could happen from that?
Yeah, that actually, now that I think about it, doesn't make sense.
One of the associated problems is, of course, child porn, which gets circulated amongst pedophiles. Oh, so we're going to put them all together in a place where there's nobody else to watch and supervise. What could go wrong? Step number 1, stop making the problem worse.
Yeah, so once we solve that, then we can get the real work done, basically.
If we want, them to change their behavior, we're going to have to change ours. It's and so many issues go like this. It's one, overcorrection leads to an overcorrection in the opposite direction, and it's just ping-ponging harder and harder, further and further, and the rational middle just gets lost. And the occasional rational person in the middle, rational is boring and doesn't get retweeted.
I have learned a ton of information.
As you've heard, it's not actually a huge ton of information. It's just you need to keep the adrenaline in check in order to process it. But if you just take a deep breath, it all fits together and makes sense. It's stunning how far out of our usual thinking it gets us. But it's really just a couple of basics is really all we need.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of work to be done. And I mean, part of it is just having conversations and
doing what you two are doing.
Yeah, trying.
I've been at this for a long time and it's my career. You two are the ones showing guts.
Thanks, James.
Perfect. I look forward to it. My pleasure.
Thank you
so much. We'd like to thank Dr. James Cantor for joining us on the podcast today.
To learn more about James Cantor, check out his website at jamescantor.org. We'll have a link in our episode's show notes. Dr. Cantor did his master's in psychology from Boston University and his PhD in psychology from McGill University. He's also the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and papers in the role of the brain in human sexual interests and atypical sexualities.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Bound by the Cloak. As always, you can find us on social media. We are on X, we are on Threads, we are on Instagram, and even TikTok. Hopefully, TikTok's around for a while. And you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.
Until next time.